Arthur Smith stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his third-floor study, his silhouette framed against the encroaching twilight. At 60, he was a man of deliberate pauses and sharp observations, the undisputed master of the psychological thriller. His novels had sold millions, fueled by his uncanny ability to dissect the darkest corners of the human heart. To the world, Arthur was a titan of intellect and wealth, living in a sprawling neo-Gothic estate that felt more like a fortress than a home. But as he watched the fog roll over the manicured emerald lawns, he felt an icy draft that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. It was the silence of the house, a heavy, suffocating quiet that had been growing for months. He turned as the heavy oak door creaked open. Sarah entered, carrying 2 glasses of vintage Bordeaux. At 45, she was a masterpiece of grace and calculated charm, her blonde hair swept back in a way that emphasized the sharpness of her cheekbones. She had been his muse, his confidant, and for the last 15 years, his wife. She walked toward him with a rhythmic elegance, the silk of her dress whispering against the Persian rug. "You're brooding again, Arthur," she said, her voice like velvet. She handed him a glass, her fingers lingering against his for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Is the new manuscript giving you trouble?" Arthur glanced at his mahogany desk, where a stack of papers lay under a silver paperweight. It was a story about a brilliant man who is slowly erased from his own life by someone he trusts. "It's not the writing, Sarah. It's the ending. I can't decide if the protagonist realizes he's being hunted before or after the trap snaps shut." Sarah smiled, a thin, enigmatic curve of the lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps he shouldn't realize it at all. Isn't the most perfect tragedy the one where the victim goes to his grave believing he was loved?" She leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning his handwritten notes. Arthur watched her, a faint sense of unease stirring in his chest. He attributed it to the medication he had started taking for his recent bouts of insomnia, pills Sarah had insisted he take to preserve his health. He felt a wave of sudden lethargy wash over him, his limbs feeling heavier by the second. He took a sip of the wine, the rich, dark liquid tasting slightly metallic, but he was too tired to question it. "Go to sleep, Arthur," she whispered, stepping closer to guide him toward the leather armchair. "You've earned a long, deep rest. I'll take care of everything." As Arthur's vision began to blur, the room seemed to stretch and distort. He saw Sarah's face one last time before his eyelids became too heavy to hold. She wasn't looking at him with pity. She was looking at the safe behind the painting on the wall, her expression one of cold, hungry anticipation. Hours later, the house became the setting for a scene far more grisly than anything Arthur had ever typed. While the master of the house lay in a chemically induced stupor, the stage was meticulously set. Sarah's secret lover, a man in his late 20s with the calloused hands of a laborer and the eyes of an opportunist, emerged from the shadows of the guest wing. Together, they worked with the efficiency of professional cleaners. They utilized the very research Arthur had left scattered on his desk. They shattered a priceless Ming vase near the foyer, scattering porcelain shards like jagged teeth across the floor. They dragged a heavy rug across the hardwood to create the distinct scuff marks of a struggle. Finally, using a vial of blood drawn from a local butcher and mixed with Arthur's own rare blood type, stolen from his private medical supplies, they created a gruesome trail that led from the study, down the back stairs, and out toward the jagged cliffs that overlooked the churning Atlantic. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the transformation was complete. Sarah had placed a frantic, tear-filled call to the local precinct, her voice a symphony of practiced terror. Arthur woke to the sound of crashing wood. His front door had been breached. Disoriented and nauseous, he tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. He crawled toward the hallway, his mind screaming for clarity, only to find himself staring into the high-intensity beams of tactical flashlights. "Arthur Smith, hands where we can see them," a voice boomed. Arthur squinted, his head throbbing. He saw the lead investigator, Detective Miller, a man who had consulted Arthur on several cases in the past. But Miller wasn't looking for advice today. He was looking at the blood on Arthur's cuffs, blood Sarah had smeared there while he slept. He was looking at the suicide note Sarah had forged in Arthur's own handwriting, confessing to a fit of rage and the disposal of his wife's body in the ocean. "Where is she, Arthur?" Miller asked, his voice thick with disappointment and disgust. I I don't know. Arthur stammered, his voice a dry rasp. She was right here. She gave me wine. We found the wine, Arthur. And we found the struggle in the hall. We found your prints on the broken vase and her blood on your sleeves. Miller stepped forward, the handcuffs gleaming in the harsh morning light. Your wife is gone, and the only person with a motive to make her disappear is the man who wrote the manual on how to do it. As the steel rings bit into his wrists, Arthur looked past the officers. He saw Sarah's car missing from the driveway, and in that moment of crushing betrayal, the fog in his mind cleared. He wasn't a victim in a story anymore. He was a man framed by his own genius, discarded by the woman he had enriched, and hunted by the law he had spent a lifetime studying. The master of mysteries had been trapped in a plot of his own making, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he would live to see the final chapter. The siren's wail was a jagged blade cutting through the morning mist, but to Arthur Smith, it sounded like a funeral dirge for a life that no longer existed. As the police cruiser bumped down the long, gravel driveway of his estate, Arthur sat in the back seat, his wrists heavy with steel. He didn't look back at the mansion. He was too busy staring at the rain-streaked window, his mind already beginning to deconstruct the crime scene with the cold, clinical precision of a man who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of the impossible escape. He knew the evidence was overwhelming. The blood on his sleeves, the forged note, the missing body. It was a masterpiece of deception. Sarah had used his own brilliance as a weapon against him. But as they reached the main highway, a sudden, violent jolt rocked the car. A massive delivery truck, skidding on the slick, rain-drenched asphalt, slammed into the front of the cruiser. The world became a kaleidoscope of shattering glass, screaming metal, and blinding white light. When the spinning stopped, Arthur found himself hanging upside down, held in place by his seatbelt. The driver was unconscious, slumped over a deployed airbag that hissed like a dying snake. The second officer was groaning, clutching a bloody shoulder. The smell of gasoline filled the air, sharp and terrifying. Arthur's survival instinct, dormant for years under the comfort of his wealth, roared to life. He reached into the unconscious driver's belt, his fingers fumbling with the key ring until he felt the cold bite of the handcuff key. With a click, he was free. He kicked out the shattered side window and crawled into the freezing rain, disappearing into the thick woods before the first witnesses could stop their cars. By nightfall, Arthur Smith, the millionaire, the celebrity, the legend, was gone. In his place was a shadow. He found refuge in an abandoned hunting cabin miles from the crash site. His body ached, his 60-year-old bones protesting every movement, but his mind was on fire. He knew the police would have every highway blocked. They would check his bank accounts, his credit cards, his hidden properties. Sarah would expect him to run to his money. So, he chose to run toward nothing. He moved under the cover of darkness, avoiding the glow of streetlights and the watchful eyes of security cameras. He remembered the research he had done for his third novel, The Invisible Man, where he had interviewed homeless veterans about the art of vanishing. He traded his cashmere coat for a tattered, oil-stained parka he found in a dumpster behind a roadside diner. He smeared dirt on his face and flattened his silver hair under a discarded baseball cap. Within 48 hours, the transformation was complete. Arthur Smith had become Robert Hayes, a nameless drifter with no past and a very dangerous future. He eventually reached the outskirts of a nearby city, a place of gray concrete and forgotten people. He didn't check into a hotel. He found a spot in a crowded homeless shelter, a cavernous room filled with the scent of unwashed bodies and desperation. It was here, amidst the coughs and the low murmurs of the broken, that Arthur began his real work. He sat on a thin, stained mattress, his back against a cold brick wall. To anyone else, he looked like just another old man crushed by the world. But behind his eyes, a complex map was being drawn. He wasn't just hiding. He was hunting. He realized that Sarah's plan had one fatal flaw. She believed her husband was a man of words, not action. She thought he would crumble without his fine wine and silk sheets. She didn't realize that a writer is a thief of experiences, a man who knows how to survive in 1,000 different skins. Arthur pulled a small, damp notebook from his pocket, one he had snatched from the diner's counter. He began to write, not a story, but a list of Sarah's weaknesses. Her vanity, her reliance on her lover, her greed. He knew she would be celebrating now, drinking his champagne and planning how to liquidate his assets. She would think she had written the final chapter of Arthur Smith. Life doesn't bend to us, he whispered to himself, echoing a line from his own philosophy. It responds. He felt the cold seep into his joints, but his heart was burning. He had lost his home, his reputation, and his wife. He was a fugitive, a ghost in a city that didn't care if he lived or died. But for the first time in decades, Arthur Smith felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. He was no longer the man who wrote about the darkness. He was the man who lived in it. And from this darkness, he would build a truth so sharp it would tear Sarah's perfect world to pieces. The hunt had begun, and the master of mysteries was finally playing for keeps. Life in the shadows was not merely a means of survival. For Arthur Smith, it was a rigorous masterclass in observation. The city's underbelly was a world he had often described in his novels, but living within its grimy ribs was a different reality entirely. He was no longer the man who spent $500 on a bottle of scotch. He was the man who spent 3 hours standing in a breadline, his eyes scanning the faces around him for the slightest hint of a threat or an opportunity. He settled into this St. Jude's home for men, a decaying brick building that smelled of damp wool and industrial-grade disinfectant. He slept on a cot that creaked with every breath, surrounded by men who had been discarded by society, much like he had been discarded by Sarah. To the staff, he was just another Robert Hayes, a quiet senior citizen with haunted eyes and steady hands. But while the other men spent their days staring blankly at the flickering television in the common room, Arthur was working. He spent his mornings at the public library, hidden behind a mountain of newspapers and computer monitors. Using his knowledge of digital footprints, research he had conducted for his cyber thriller The Ghost Protocol, he began to track the movements of his own estate. It was agonizing to see. Under the guise of a grieving widow, Sarah was moving fast. She had already petitioned the court to declare him missing and presumed dangerous, a legal maneuver that allowed her to freeze his primary accounts and take control of his intellectual property. But Arthur knew Sarah better than she knew herself. She was a woman of expensive tastes and short patience. She wouldn't be satisfied with a slow, legal crawl. She wanted the great prize, the $10 million insurance policy, and the silent Swiss accounts he had mentioned in passing during their honeymoon. On his third week in the shelter, Arthur began to fix things. He started small. He repaired a broken radiator in the dining hall using a paperclip and a piece of gum, a trick he'd given his protagonist in the MacGyver Gambit. He reorganized the shelter's chaotic filing system, making himself indispensable to the overworked director. By becoming useful, he became invisible. People stopped looking at him as a stranger and started seeing him as a fixture. This gave him the cover he needed to slip out undetected for hours at a time. He began to frequent a high-end bistro 3 blocks away from his former lawyer's office. Dressed in a cleaned-up version of his drifter clothes, he sat on a nearby park bench, watching the coming and going of the city's elite through a pair of cheap binoculars he had bartered from a pawn shop. On Tuesday, he saw what he was looking for: Sarah's lover, the man he now knew as Julian Vane, exiting the building with a smug, predatory grin. Julian was wearing one of Arthur's bespoke Italian suits. The sight sent a jolt of primal rage through Arthur's veins, but he forced it down. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Logic was his only weapon. Arthur followed Julian at a distance, utilizing the 3-block pivot technique he had once written about in a handbook for aspiring mystery writers. He watched as Julian met with a shady private investigator in a secluded corner of a dive bar. Arthur sat in the booth behind them, his cap pulled low, his ears straining to catch their whispers over the roar of the jukebox. "The old man's body still hasn't washed up," Julian hissed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of greed and fear. "The cops are starting to ask questions about the blood patterns. They say it doesn't match a struggle." "Don't sweat it," the investigator replied, his voice a gravelly rumble. "As long as he stays dead, you're golden. But if Smith is alive, he's the most dangerous man on the planet. He knows how to disappear better than anyone." Arthur allowed himself a ghost of a smile. They were afraid. The perfect crime was beginning to fray at the edges, the stitches popping under the pressure of their own paranoia. Sarah and Julian weren't criminal masterminds. They were just amateurs playing with a professional's tools. Returning to the shelter that night, Arthur sat on his cot and opened his notebook. He began to draft a new kind of story. It wasn't a novel meant for the bestseller lists. It was a blueprint for a trap. He realized that to catch Sarah, he didn't need to go to the police. They were already convinced of his guilt. He needed to lead Sarah into a situation where she would expose herself. He looked around the room at the broken men sleeping around him. He realized that he had spent his life writing about heroes, but he had never truly understood what it meant to be one. A hero wasn't someone with a gun or a badge. A hero was someone who could lose everything and still choose to do what was right. The truth is a patient hunter, he whispered into the darkness of the shelter. He felt the cold air whistling through the cracks in the window, but he didn't shiver. He was no longer Arthur Smith, the victim. He was the architect of a new reality. He had lived through the betrayal. He had survived the storm, and now he was ready to write the ending his enemies deserved. The world thought he was erased, but Arthur knew that sometimes you have to burn the old page to write something truly worth reading. The library had become Arthur's sanctuary, but more importantly, it was his command center. Sitting in a secluded corner behind a fortress of dusty reference books, Arthur felt the familiar hum of an investigation clicking into place. For decades, he had invented killers. Now, he was analyzing one he had shared a bed with for 15 years. He realized he had made a critical error during his marriage. He had mistaken Sarah's vanity for simplicity. In reality, her greed was a complex, multi-layered machine, and it was currently running at full throttle. Using a burner phone he had acquired through a trade at the shelter, Arthur began to weave a digital net. He knew that Sarah's lover, Julian, was the weak link. Julian was young, arrogant, and possessed a thirst for the high life that far outstripped his intelligence. Arthur created a series of encrypted email accounts and began sending anonymous tips to various high-end real estate agents and art dealers that Sarah was in contact with. He framed these tips as due diligence inquiries from a private Swiss bank, hinting that the Smith estate was under a quiet federal audit. The goal wasn't to stop her yet, it was to make her move faster. In his novels, Arthur often wrote that panic is the mother of all mistakes. He watched through the library's public computer as Sarah began to liquidate his assets at an alarming, almost desperate rate. She was selling his rare book collection, his vintage car, and even the rights to his back catalog for cents on the dollar. She was trying to turn everything into cash before the audit could freeze her out. But Arthur's real breakthrough came when he utilized his writer's eye for detail. He remembered Sarah's obsession with a specific, high-end jewelry boutique in the city, a place where every transaction was recorded with meticulous care for their elite clientele. He knew Sarah would go there to sell the 5-carat diamond anniversary ring he had bought her 3 years ago. It was her escape hatch fund. Dressed in a faded mechanic's jumpsuit he had salvaged, Arthur spent 2 days perched in a coffee shop across from the boutique. On the 3rd day, he saw her. Sarah stepped out of a Blacktown car, looking every bit the grieving widow in a designer black veil and a tailored wool coat. She walked with a hurried, nervous energy that Arthur recognized immediately. It was the walk of a character who knew the police were just 1 block behind. He waited until she exited the shop 20 minutes later, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched her handbag. As soon as her car pulled away, Arthur entered the boutique. He didn't look like a millionaire anymore. He looked like a grandfatherly handyman. He approached the manager, a man he had dealt with many times in his former life, though the man now looked at him with nothing but mild condescension. "Excuse me, sir," Arthur said, his voice raspy and humble. "That lady who just left, she dropped this near the door." He held out a small, insignificant gold earring he had bought at a pawn shop for $5. The manager sighed, taking the bait. "I'll put it in the lost and found. Mrs. Smith was in such a rush. I'm not surprised she was careless. She's had a very difficult month, you know." "I can imagine," Arthur murmured. "Must be hard, selling off such beautiful things. Did she get what she needed for that big diamond?" The manager, perhaps feeling a rare moment of sympathy for the old man, or simply wanting to boast about the shop's high-stakes transactions, leaned in. "She didn't sell it. She tried to, but the serial number on the laser inscription didn't match the certificate she brought. It was a very strange discrepancy. We had to decline the buyback until we could verify the origin with the GI." Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. He had predicted this. Months ago, sensing something was wrong, He had swapped the diamond in Sarah's ring with a high-quality synthetic and hidden the original in a safe deposit box she didn't know existed. He had left her a trap without even knowing he was doing it. She must have been upset, Arthur said. Livid, the manager replied. She left in quite a hurry to meet someone at the Grand Hotel. Her lawyer, I believe she called him. Arthur thanked the man and walked out into the crisp afternoon air. He didn't need to follow her to the Grand Hotel to know who the lawyer was. It was Julian. And more importantly, Arthur now knew that Sarah was running out of liquid cash. The audit, rumors, and the rejected diamond had cornered her. He walked back toward the shelter, his mind racing. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was the director of a play that was reaching its climax. He had the location, he had the motive, and he had the psychological pressure point. Sarah thought she was the one who had buried Arthur Smith, but she had forgotten the most basic rule of his genre. Never assume the body is actually in the grave until you've seen the face. Arthur sat on a park bench, watching a group of children play near a fountain. He pulled out his notebook and drew a single line through the name Sarah. Below it, he wrote, Phase 5, the reunion. He realized that his wealth was gone, his home was compromised, and his name was dragged through the mud. But as he looked at his steady, weathered hands, he knew he had never been more powerful. He was a man with nothing left to lose and a story that demanded an ending. And he was going to make sure it was a bestseller. Arthur Smith knew that to catch a predator, you had to make them feel like they were the one being hunted by something they couldn't see. He spent the next few days orchestrating a symphony of psychological warfare from the flickering screens of the public library. Sarah and Julian were already on edge, their nerves frayed by the audit and the failed diamond sale. Now, Arthur was going to push them over the precipice. Using his deep knowledge of the publishing world, Arthur leaked a teaser of a supposedly lost manuscript to his old literary agent via an encrypted, untraceable server. The title was The Widow's Web. The sample chapters weren't just fiction. They were a play-by-play recreation of the night Sarah had drugged him and staged the crime scene. He included details only the perpetrators would know, the exact brand of the wine, the specific vase that was shattered, and the precise words Julian had whispered in the hallway. The news hit the literary blogs within hours. The final ghost of Arthur Smith, the headlines screamed. The media speculated that Arthur had programmed a delayed release of a book that predicted his own murder. To the public, it was a haunting coincidental masterpiece. To Sarah and Julian, it was a death warrant signed from the grave. Arthur watched from a distance as the lights in his former mansion stayed on until dawn. He sat in his stolen mechanic's jumpsuit on a park bench across the street, a thermos of cheap coffee in his hand, watching the shadows move behind the curtains. He could almost hear their frantic arguments. Sarah would be accusing Julian of leaking details. Julian would be spiraling into a paranoid frenzy, wondering if Arthur was a ghost or a god. But Arthur needed a catalyst, a reason for them to come to him. He sent a final, direct message to Sarah's private burner phone. It contained nothing but a GPS coordinate and a time. The following evening at the abandoned pier where they had allegedly dumped his body. The message was signed with a single word, Chapter 7. The next night, the fog was so thick it swallowed the sound of the churning Atlantic. Arthur arrived at the pier early. He wasn't the frail man who had been dragged away in handcuffs weeks ago. His time in the shelter and the sheer force of his will had hardened him. He had spent the afternoon preparing the stage, using his knowledge of suspense to ensure every shadow and every creak of the wood worked in his favor. At exactly 11 p.m., a black town car pulled onto the gravel path. Sarah and Julian stepped out, looking like two characters from a noir film, pale, shivering, and clutching a heavy briefcase. They expected to find a blackmailer. They expected to find someone they could pay off or kill. Instead, they found a voice. You always did have a poor sense of pacing, Sarah. Arthur's voice boomed through a portable megaphone he had hidden beneath the pier's deck, making it sound as if the very wood was speaking. You rushed the ending. A good mystery requires a slow burn, a gradual revelation of the truth. Who's there? Julian shouted, waving a flashlight wildly into the mist. Show yourself. I'm the one who knows where the original diamond is, Arthur replied, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. I'm the one who has the recording of your conversation in the dive bar. And I'm the one who wrote the ending you're about to live. Sarah stepped forward, her face a mask of terror and rage. Arthur, is that you? You're dead. You fell off the cliff. A common trope, Sarah. The off-screen death is rarely permanent in my world, Arthur said, stepping out from behind a rusted shipping container. The moonlight hit his silver hair, making him look like a vengeful spirit. He didn't have a gun. He didn't need one. He had a digital tablet in his hand. This tablet is connected to a live stream, Arthur said, holding it up. My agent, my lawyer, and the lead detective on my case are all watching. Every word you say is being recorded and broadcast. Tell me, Julian, did Sarah tell you about the Swiss accounts? Or did she plan to dispose of you just like she did me? The seeds of doubt Arthur had planted weeks ago bloomed instantly. Julian turned to Sarah, his eyes wide with suspicion. What is he talking about? You said we were in this together. He's lying. He's trying to turn us against each other. Sarah screamed, but the panic in her voice was a confession in itself. Arthur watched as the two people who had tried to erase him began to tear each other apart. Julian grabbed Sarah's arm, demanding the briefcase. Sarah fought back, her elegant facade finally shattering into a jagged mess of greed and desperation. They were so busy screaming at each other that they didn't hear the silent approach of the black and white cruisers. As the blue and red lights suddenly cut through the fog, Arthur didn't run. He stood his ground, a man restored. He watched as Detective Miller stepped out of the lead car, his face unreadable as he looked at the dead man standing before him. The truth isn't just a plot point, Sarah, Arthur whispered as the officers moved in to cuff the struggling couple. It's a consequence. He looked out at the dark water, the same water they thought had claimed him. He felt the cold wind on his face, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't cold. He had reached the climax of his own story, and for once, the ending was exactly what he had intended. He was Arthur Smith, and his greatest work wasn't on a bookshelf. It was standing right here, in the cold, honest air of the truth. The courtroom was silent, a stark contrast to the chaotic fog of the pier where the nightmare had reached its boiling point. Arthur Smith sat behind the prosecution table, wearing a charcoal suit that felt like a suit of armor. He looked younger, the exhaustion of the fugitive life replaced by the grim clarity of a man who had seen the bottom of the abyss and climbed out. Across the aisle, Sarah and Julian sat behind bulletproof glass, their faces pale and drawn. The media circus outside was deafening, but inside these wood-paneled walls, only the truth had a voice. Detective Miller was the first to take the stand. He recounted the night of the arrest with a mixture of professional detachment and lingering guilt. We found the digital tablet Mr. Smith was holding, Miller testified, his eyes briefly meeting Arthur's. It wasn't just a live stream. It was a sophisticated trap. The device had captured 30 minutes of high-definition audio and video. In those recordings, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Vane explicitly discussed the staging of the crime scene, the disposal of the body, and the distribution of the insurance payout. They weren't just suspects, they were their own star witnesses. As the evidence was presented, the gallery gasped. Arthur's defense team, now his prosecution assistants, laid out the trail of breadcrumbs Arthur had meticulously gathered during his time as Robert Hayes. They showed the security footage from the jewelry boutique, the records of the audit rumors Arthur had planted, and most damningly, the original 5-carat diamond he had recovered from his private safe. The ring Sarah had tried to sell was a fake, just as her grief had been. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she tried one last performance. She wept into a silk handkerchief, claiming that Arthur had been abusive, that she was a victim of his psychological games, and that Julian had manipulated her. But the writer's engeep view Arthur had used against her was too thorough. Every lie she told was immediately countered by a piece of physical evidence he had secured weeks prior. He had anticipated her script before she even wrote it. Julian, however, broke first. Faced with 20 years for attempted murder and conspiracy, he turned on Sarah with a ferocity that shocked the court. He detailed how Sarah had planned the murder for over a year, how she had studied Arthur's manuscripts to find a flaw in the police's investigative logic, and how she had planned to kill Julian too once the money was laundered. The betrayal Arthur had felt on that first night was now being mirrored between his enemies, a poetic symmetry that Arthur observed with a cold, detached fascination. During a recess, Arthur stood in the hallway, looking out at the city he had once hidden in. Detective Miller approached him, removing his hat. "I owe you an apology, Arthur," the detective said quietly. I should have known that a man who spent his life studying the human soul wouldn't throw his own life away like that. You played us all. I didn't play anyone, Miller, Arthur replied, his voice steady. I simply allowed the story to follow its natural logic. People like Sarah believe they can edit reality to suit their needs. I just made sure they couldn't find an eraser. The jury didn't need long. When they returned, the verdict was a rhythmic drumbeat of justice. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, grand larceny, and obstruction of justice. As the judge read the sentence, Sarah's knees buckled. She looked at Arthur, her eyes wide with a plea for mercy, but she found none. She had tried to turn his life into a tragedy. He had turned hers into a cautionary tale. As they were led away in chains, Arthur didn't feel the rush of triumph he had expected. Instead, he felt a profound sense of closure. He walked out of the courthouse, past the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi and the shouting reporters. He didn't stop to give a statement. He had already written his statement in the lives of the people who tried to destroy him. He returned to his mansion that evening. It was empty and cold, the shattered vase replaced by a new one, the bloodstains scrubbed from the floor. But he didn't feel at home. He realized that the man who had lived here before, the arrogant, comfortable writer, was dead. The man who stood here now was someone else. He went to his study, sat at his mahogany desk, and picked up a pen. For the first time in years, he wasn't writing for a paycheck or a deadline. He was writing because he finally understood the weight of every word. He began to draft the final chapter of his life, not as a master of mysteries, but as a witness to the truth. The world had tried to erase him, but in doing so, it had given him the only story worth telling. Arthur Smith sat on the porch of his beach house, far from the Gothic mansion that had once been his fortress and his cage. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out before him, a vast, restless gray that mirrored the state of his own mind. At 61, he was no longer the man the world recognized from the glossy back covers of bestsellers. His hair had turned a stark, snowy white, and the lines on his face were deeper, etched by the cold nights in the shelter and the searing heat of the courtroom. But his eyes were clear, no longer clouded by the comfortable delusions of his former life. The silence here was different. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of a house filled with secrets. It was the honest silence of a man who had finally stopped running. In his hand, he held a heavy, leather-bound volume, the first printed copy of his new book. It wasn't a thriller, and it wasn't a mystery. It was a memoir titled The Invisible Author. It was the story of how Arthur Smith had to die so that a real man could be born. He opened the book to the final page, his fingers tracing the ink. He thought back to the day the verdict was handed down. Sarah and Julian were gone, locked away in separate federal facilities where their only audience would be concrete walls and iron bars. He had been offered his fortune back, every cent of it. He had reclaimed his name, his copyrights, and his estate. But when he had walked back into that mansion, he realized he didn't want it. The silk sheets felt like shrouds. The expensive wine tasted like ash. He had sold the estate and donated 80% of the proceeds to the St. Jude's Home for men and other shelters across the country. He kept only enough to live simply, here by the sea. A car pulled up the gravel driveway. It was Detective Miller. He wasn't wearing his badge today. He was in a flannel shirt and jeans, looking like a man who had finally retired from the darkness. He walked up to the porch and sat in the wicker chair next to Arthur. I read the advance copy, Miller said, nodding toward the book. The part about the shelter. I never realized how much we overlook until someone like you puts it under a microscope. You made us look at the people we usually walk past. I spent my life writing about monsters, Miller, Arthur said, his voice gravelly but warm. I never realized that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in masks. They're the ones who sit across from you at dinner and smile while they plan your disappearance. But I also didn't realize that the greatest heroes are the ones who share their last piece of bread in a basement because they know what it's like to have nothing. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the waves crash against the jagged rocks. Do you hate her? Miller asked quietly. After everything? Arthur looked out at the horizon. I did. For a long time, the anger was the only thing keeping me warm. But hate is just another way of staying connected to someone. I don't want to be connected to Sarah anymore. She was a character in a story I finished reading. Now, I've closed the book. Miller stood up to leave, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder. You've done something few people ever do, Arthur. You got a second chance at a first impression. Most people just get one ending. You wrote yourself a new beginning. After Miller left, Arthur picked up his pen. He had one final task. He wrote a short note to the director of St. Jude's, enclosing a check that would ensure no man would have to sleep on a cold floor in that city again. He didn't sign it as the famous Arthur Smith. He simply signed it, Robert Hayes. The sun began to set, casting a long, golden path across the water. Arthur stood up slowly. His body protested the movement. The lingering aches of the car crash and the nights on the street would stay with him forever, but his steps were steady. He felt a profound sense of peace. He realized that for decades, he had tried to control every plot point, every character, and every twist in his life. He had built a world of fiction to protect himself from the unpredictability of reality. But the truth had broken through. It had stripped him bare, humiliated him, and pushed him to the edge of death. And in doing so, it had saved him. He understood now that life isn't a manuscript you can edit until it's perfect. It's a series of responses to the things we cannot control. He looked back at his small house, the lights glowing warmly in the twilight. He was no longer a master of mysteries. He was just a man, standing on the edge of a vast world, ready to see what the next day would bring. He had spent his life building a legacy out of paper and ink, but in the end, the only thing that truly lasted, the only thing that carried any weight, was the truth. Arthur Smith smiled, a genuine, quiet expression of contentment. He turned and walked into his home, leaving the door unlocked. He wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. He had been through the storm, he had faced the shadow, and he had come out the other side. The final chapter wasn't about revenge or riches. It was about the quiet dignity of a man who finally knew who he was. Life doesn't bend to us. It responds. And for Arthur Smith, the response was finally, beautifully, enough.